Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them, away from your waist. Now,
My hands are visible, officer.
if you turn that key, I will consider it a threat.
Officer, I am unlocking my front door. My hands are visible. I am not reaching for anything, and I am not armed.
I said stop moving. Step back from the door. Do not enter that residence.
Officer, I live here. I have a legal right to enter my home.
We have a report of suspicious activity at this address. You match the description.
There is no report. This is a self-initiated stop. I'm asking you calmly and clearly to lower that tactical light and identify yourself by name and badge number.
Ma'am, do not tell me how to do my job. Turn around and face away from me.
I am not refusing a lawful order. I am asserting my rights. Please articulate what crime you believe I have committed.
If you do not comply immediately, you will be placed under arrest for obstruction of justice.
At exactly 9:14 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in March 2023, Officer Steve Langford of the Metro Township Police Department pulled into the tree-lined cul-de-sac of Oak Creek Estates, thinking he was about to stop a burglary in progress. He'd been patrolling one of the wealthiest zip codes in the city, a neighborhood of $1.2 million colonials with manicured lawns and three-car garages, when he spotted what he would later describe in his report as a suspicious individual attempting unauthorized entry into a secured residence. What he actually saw was a black woman in her early 40s wearing a University of Michigan law hoodie and jeans, standing at the front door of an expensive-looking brick house, fumbling with her keys while balancing a bag of Chinese takeout in one hand. To Langford, a 23-year-old rookie with only 6 months on patrol, she didn't fit the profile of someone who belonged in Oak Creek Estates. The hoodie looked too casual. The grocery bag looked too heavy. The way she was struggling with the lock looked to his inexperienced eyes like someone who didn't actually have permission to be there. What Officer Steve Langford did not know, what he was about to ignore, despite being told directly, repeatedly, and with the calm precision of someone who had spent 12 years dismantling police testimony in federal court, was that the woman at that door was not a burglar. She was Maya Sterling, a federal public defender for the Northern District, one of the most respected trial attorneys in the region. A woman who had defended constitutional rights in over 800 cases, a lawyer who had cross-examined FBI agents, DEA task force leaders, and corrupt police officers with a velvet hammer style that left their credibility in ruins without her ever raising her voice. A legal mind so sharp that federal prosecutors privately referred to her as the closer, because if Maya took your case to trial, you had a chance even when the evidence said you didn't. And in the next 47 minutes, Officer Steve Langford was about to make a series of decisions so catastrophically wrong, so blatantly rooted in racial profiling, and so thoroughly captured on high-definition doorbell camera footage that they would not just end his career, they would cost his department $3 million, invalidate a dozen of his prior arrests, trigger a complete overhaul of the department's field training program, and turn Maya Sterling from a defense attorney into a survivor with a mission. Before we go any further, I need you to drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever been made to feel like a stranger in a place you had every right to be? Your story matters. Because what happened to Maya Sterling on her own front porch happens to black professionals, black homeowners, and black Americans every single day in this country. The only reason this case is different is that Maya had the legal training, the resources, and the sheer determination to make sure Officer Langford faced consequences. If you believe that people deserve to enter their own homes without being treated like criminals, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to show you what happens when a rookie cop racially profiles the wrong attorney, and what happens when that attorney decides she's done being silent. Maya Sterling was not your average 42-year-old woman standing on her own front porch. While most people her age were thinking about their kids' soccer schedules and weekend plans, Maya was one of the most formidable defense attorneys in the federal court system. She was a federal public defender in the Northern District, appointed to her position after a decade of relentless excellence in criminal defense work. She had represented some of the most marginalized defendants in America, people accused of federal drug conspiracies, immigration violations, white-collar crimes they didn't understand, and violent offenses they swore they didn't commit. Her caseload was unrelenting. 60-hour weeks, late-night trial prep sessions, appellate briefs written at 2 a.m., and court appearances that required her to stand between her clients and the full prosecutorial power of the United States government. Her courtroom reputation was legendary. Defense attorneys in private practice envied her trial instincts. Federal judges respected her because she never wasted the court's time with frivolous motions or theatrics. Every argument was grounded in precedent. Every cross-examination was surgical. Prosecutors feared her, not because she played dirty, but because she didn't have to. Maya won cases by knowing the law better than anyone else in the room and by holding the government to its burden of proof with relentless precision. Getting to the federal public defender's office had not been a matter of luck or connections. It had been the result of a lifetime of fighting upstream. As Maya had grown up in a neighborhood where the law was not something that protected you, it was something that happened to you. Her father had worked 2 jobs as a mechanic and a night security guard. Her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs, coming home exhausted with stories about the kind of lives other people lived. Money had been tight in the way that working-class black families understood tight, not desperate poverty, but a constant grinding awareness that there was never enough margin for error. Maya had been a scholarship kid at every stage of her education. She'd been bused to a magnet high school across town where she was one of only a handful of black students. She'd worked part-time at a campus bookstore during undergrad at the University of Michigan to cover expenses her financial aid didn't reach. She'd taken out $120,000 in loans to attend law school, graduating with honors, but also with a debt load that shaped every career decision she made for the next decade. After law school, Maya could have taken a corporate law job paying $160,000 a year. Instead, she had chosen the public defender's office at a starting salary of $52,000 because she wanted to represent people who looked like her family, people who couldn't afford a $500 an hour attorney and who were being steamrolled by a system that didn't see them as human. She had spent 12 years building a reputation as the shield of the indigent. She had won acquittals in cases where the evidence seemed insurmountable. She had negotiated plea deals that saved her clients from decades in prison. She had filed motions to suppress evidence obtained through illegal searches, or challenged coerced confessions and cross-examined police officers who lied on the stand about what they saw, what they heard, and what they did. Maya Sterling had spent her entire adult life defending the Fourth Amendment. And now, standing on her own front porch with her house keys in one hand and a bag of General Tso's chicken in the other, she was about to experience firsthand what it felt like when that amendment was shredded by a rookie cop with a God complex and a badge. Officer Steve Langford was about to violate every constitutional protection Maya had spent 12 years defending in federal court. And unlike the clients she represented, unlike the people who didn't have resources, didn't have legal knowledge, didn't have doorbell cameras and federal credentials, Maya was about to make sure he paid for it. Now, Maya had seen this exact scenario play out in 1,000 police reports over her 12-year career. She knew the script by heart. An officer claims he feared for his safety. A suspect made furtive movements. A dynamic situation required immediate action. She had cross-examined dozens of cops who used these exact phrases to justify questionable arrests, and she had learned that the secret to dismantling their narrative was documentation and de-escalation. So even as the tactical light burned her retinas and Langford's voice climbed another octave, Maya forced herself to stay calm. "Officer, I'm going to reach into my pocket very slowly and show you my identification," she said, her voice steady and deliberately non-threatening. "I'm a federal public defender. My name is Maya Sterling. This is my home. If you'll just let me show you my ID, we can clear this up in 30 seconds. She moved her hand slowly toward her jacket pocket, telegraphing every movement the way she'd seen compliant suspects do in body camera footage. But Langford's brain was already writing a different story. He saw her hand moving and his training, 6 months of academy lectures about officer safety and threat assessment, kicked in with the subtlety of a car alarm. In his mind, Maya's calm tone wasn't cooperation. It was defiance. Her slow, deliberate movements weren't compliance. They were calculation. The fact that she wasn't cowering, wasn't stumbling over her words, wasn't showing the kind of fear he expected from someone being confronted by police, registered in Langford's 23-year-old brain as dangerous. This was the psychology that his field training officer had flagged in his academy evaluations as defensive projection. the tendency to interpret his own escalating anxiety as evidence that the other person was a threat. Langford's heart was pounding. His hands were shaking slightly on his service weapon. His breathing was shallow. And because he felt afraid, he needed Maya to be the cause of that fear. He needed her to be the threat. Because if she wasn't the threat, then he was just a rookie cop who had made a catastrophic mistake, and his ego couldn't process that possibility. "I said keep your hands where I can see them," Langford shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Drop whatever's in your hand. Drop it now." Maya was holding her house keys. She looked down at them, then back at Langford. And in that split second of hesitation, that single moment where she tried to process the sheer absurdity of being ordered to drop her own keys on her own porch, Langford made his decision. He lunged forward and swatted the bag of Chinese takeout from her hand. Containers exploded across the porch, scattering fried rice and orange chicken across the welcome mat her mother had given her for Christmas. Before Maya could even react, Langford kicked her feet out from under her with a move he'd practiced exactly twice in defensive tactics training. She went down hard, her shoulders slamming into the brick steps, her head narrowly missing the corner of the metal railing. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Langford screamed, even though Maya was lying completely still, her hands visible, her body frozen in shock. This was the phrase that appeared in 90% of use of force reports Maya had read, the magic words that transformed excessive force into justified restraint. But there was one critical problem. Maya wasn't resisting. She wasn't moving at all. She was doing exactly what every defense attorney tells their clients to do when confronted by police: comply, survive, and sue later. Langford dropped his knee into the small of her back with enough force to knock the wind out of her lungs. He wrenched her arms behind her back, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his handcuffs. The metal bit into her wrists as he ratcheted them down 2 clicks too tight, a violation of department policy that would later show up in the internal affairs investigation as evidence of retaliatory force. Maya felt a sharp pain radiate up her forearms, but she didn't make a sound. She had learned from her clients that any noise, any grunt of pain, any verbal protest would be documented as aggressive behavior or verbal threats. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest," Langford panted, his voice still shaking with adrenaline. "You have the right to remain silent." Maya's legal brain had already kicked into gear. Obstruction of justice required an underlying lawful investigation. Langford had no warrant, no exigent circumstances, and no articulable reasonable suspicion that would survive even the most basic Fourth Amendment analysis. Resisting arrest required a lawful arrest in the first place. Everything he was doing was building her case, brick by constitutional brick. As Langford hauled her to her feet and perp walked her toward his cruiser, Maya remained silent. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She didn't tell him he was making the biggest mistake of his career, even though she knew he was. Instead, she was doing what she'd trained herself to do in hundreds of trials. She was observing, cataloging, and documenting. She noted that Langford never asked for her name before arresting her. She noted that he never asked if she lived at the residence. She noted that his body camera, a small rectangular device clipped to his chest, had a red light that should have been green, meaning he'd either failed to activate it or had deliberately muted the audio. She noted the time on her Apple Watch, 9:22 p.m. She noted the neighbor's porch lights flickering on across the street, witnesses emerging. By the time Langford shoved her into the back of his patrol car, Maya Sterling had already begun building the case that would end his career and cost his department $3 million. She just had to survive the booking process first. The patrol car hadn't even left Oak Creek Estates before Langford grabbed his radio mic with a trembling hand. Maya could hear every word from the back seat, separated from him by a plexiglass partition that smelled like disinfectant and fear. His voice was still shaking, but now it carried a performative quality she'd heard 100 times in courtroom testimony, the officer reconstructing the narrative in real time, laying the foundation for justification. "Dispatch, this is Unit 347. I've got one in custody, female, black, approximately 40 years old. Advise. I had a combative suspect who attempted to evade lawful detention. Subject was aggressive and non-compliant throughout the encounter. I'm 10-8, transporting to central booking." He paused, and Maya could see his eyes flick to the rearview mirror, checking to see if she was listening. Be advised, this was a close call. Suspect made movements toward my duty belt. Officer safety situation. I'll need a supervisor for the use of force report. Maya's jaw tightened. There it was. The first lie. She hadn't made any movements toward his belt. She'd been trying to show him her ID, but Langford was already building his defense, painting himself as the victim who'd narrowly escaped a dangerous encounter. This was textbook defensive projection, the psychological phenomenon where an officer's own fear and aggression gets reframed as the suspect's threatening behavior. She'd seen it destroy cases, end careers, and send innocent people to prison. The difference was that this time, she had evidence that would prove it was a lie. 45 minutes later, Langford sat at a desk in the precinct's report writing room, staring at a blank incident report template on his computer screen. His hands had finally stopped shaking, but his mind was racing. He knew the use of force threshold. He knew that taking someone to the ground required articulable justification beyond, "she didn't listen to me." He needed a threat. He needed a reason that would satisfy his sergeant, the department's legal team, and the inevitable review board. So he created one. In the narrative section of his report, Langford typed the words that would obliterate his career. Suspect became increasingly agitated and made a sudden movement toward my service weapon with her right hand. Fearing for my safety and the safety of the community, I utilized a defensive takedown to gain control of the suspect and prevent her from accessing my firearm. Suspect continued to resist throughout the detention, requiring firm but necessary physical restraint. It was a complete fabrication, but in Langford's mind, it felt true. He'd been scared. She'd moved her hand. Those two facts blurred together in his adrenaline-soaked memory until he couldn't separate what actually happened from what he needed to have happened. This is how officers end up lying under oath, not always through conscious malice, but through a self-protective psychological process where their fear becomes their evidence. Meanwhile, 3 rooms away in the booking area, Maya Sterling was teaching a masterclass in how to protect your rights from inside a jail cell. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't demanded to speak to a supervisor or threatened to sue anyone. Instead, she'd done something far more devastating. She'd spoken in the calm, procedural language of the law. "Sergeant," she said to the booking officer, a 20-year veteran named Rodriguez who looked exhausted, "I need to make a formal request for preservation of evidence pursuant to Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 37E. I am specifically requesting that your department immediately preserve all body-worn camera footage, dashboard camera footage, dispatch audio recordings, and any residential security camera footage from the incident location at 1847 Oak Creek Circle. I'm also requesting preservation of all written reports, field notes, and training records related to Officer Langford." Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork, his pen frozen mid-signature. "Ma'am, you can make those requests through your attorney." "I am an attorney," Maya interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I am a federal public defender for the Northern District. My bar number is 847293. I am making this request in my capacity as a future civil plaintiff, and I am advising you that spoliation of evidence at this point would constitute willful destruction and would result in sanctions under federal law. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Sergeant?" The room went quiet. Rodriguez set down his pen and looked at Maya, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd been brought in. He saw the University of Michigan hoodie, the Georgetown Law School class ring on her finger, the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. He saw a woman who wasn't just familiar with the system, she was a master of it. "I need to get my supervisor," Rodriguez said quietly, standing up from his desk. 20 minutes later, a lieutenant, a watch commander, and the department's legal advisor were crowded into a small conference room, watching footage from Maya's Ring doorbell camera on a laptop. The camera had captured everything in crystal clear 1080p high definition. The timestamp in the corner read 9:14 p.m. The audio was perfect. They watched Langford's patrol car pull up. They watched him approach Maya with his flashlight and his hand on his weapon. They watched Maya hold up her keys and explain, calmly and clearly, that she lived there. They watched her reach slowly toward her pocket to retrieve her ID. And then they watched Langford explode into violence, swatting the takeout bag from her hands, kicking her legs out from under her, driving her into the ground while she lay motionless and compliant. The silence in the conference room was suffocating. The legal advisor closed the laptop and looked at the watch commander with an expression that needed no translation. "We have a massive problem." Langford had just written a sworn statement claiming Maya had lunged for his weapon. The video showed a woman standing perfectly still, trying to show her identification, and getting assaulted on her own front porch by a rookie cop who saw a threat that didn't exist. The lie wasn't just bad. It was career-ending. It was lawsuit-triggering. It was the kind of lie that would invalidate every arrest Langford had ever made and expose the department to millions in liability. By midnight, Maya Sterling had been released without charges. But the real reckoning was just beginning. 3 days after Maya's arrest, an unmarked manila envelope appeared in her mailbox. There was no return address, no note, just a single photocopied document with a handwritten post-it note stuck to the front. "Thought you should see this. He never should have made it out of the academy." The document was Officer Steve Langford's psychological evaluation from his field training period. And it read like a prophecy of everything that had happened on Maya's porch. The evaluation had been conducted by Field Training Officer Marcus Webb, a 15-year veteran who'd been assigned to shadow Langford during his probationary period. Webb's assessment was damning. Officer Langford displays a high propensity for defensive projection during citizen encounters. When his authority is questioned, he interprets the questioning as a personal threat rather than a constitutional right. On 3 separate occasions, I observed Officer Langford escalate situations unnecessarily because he perceived calm, articulate responses from citizens as defiance or combativeness. Officer Langford has verbalized that he views policing as a war and citizens who don't immediately comply as combatants. I have significant concerns about his ability to de-escalate situations and recommend additional psychological screening before he is cleared for solo patrol. The recommendation had been ignored. Langford had been cleared for solo patrol anyway, and 6 months later, he'd proven every one of Webb's concerns correct. Maya read the evaluation 3 times, her legal mind already cataloging how this document would demolish any claim of qualified immunity in her civil suit. This wasn't an officer who made a split-second mistake. This was an officer with a documented history of the exact behavior that led to her assault, and the department had put him on the street anyway. The whistleblower's leak triggered an internal affairs investigation that immediately exposed Langford's second major lie. When investigators pulled the dispatch logs for the night of March 14th, they found something stunning. There was no 911 call about a burglary in progress at 1847 Oak Creek Circle. There was no concerned neighbor reporting suspicious activity. The dispatch audio that investigators reviewed showed that Langford had radioed in the stop himself, using the phrase self-initiated suspicious person investigation, which meant he'd decided on his own, based solely on what he saw, that Maya looked like she didn't belong. This destroyed the legal foundation of the entire encounter. Langford had told Maya, on camera, that we have a report of suspicious activity. He'd told dispatch that he was responding to a call. He'd written in his sworn statement that he'd been dispatched to investigate a possible burglary. All lies. He'd manufactured reasonable suspicion out of thin air, or more accurately, out of racial bias. A black woman in an expensive neighborhood had looked wrong to him, so he'd invented a justification for stopping her. This wasn't just a bad arrest. It was evidence of racial profiling so blatant that even the police union's lawyers winced when they saw the case file. While the internal investigation churned forward, something unprecedented began happening in Oak Creek Estates. Maya's neighbors, the same people who lived in those $1.2 million homes and who typically kept to themselves, started organizing. They wrote letters to the mayor, the police chief, and the city council. They showed up at city hall meetings wearing Justice for Maya t-shirts. They hired a billboard on the highway leading into the city that read, Maya Sterling was arrested at her own front door. How many others? The contrast was impossible to ignore. When Maya's clients, poor defendants, mostly black and brown, many with prior records, got brutalized by police, there were no billboards. There were no coordinated letter-writing campaigns. There was just a public defender like Maya, fighting alone in a courtroom while the system ground her clients into dust. But when the victim was a respected professional with resources, connections, and a zip code that city officials cared about, the machinery of accountability suddenly started working. And it was a stark reminder that justice in America often depends not on what happened, but on who it happened to. Maya understood this better than anyone. She'd spent 12 years watching the system protect bad cops and punish poor defendants. She'd seen officers lie under oath and get promoted. She'd seen clients tell the truth and get buried. The difference now was that she had what her clients never had: documentation, credibility, resources, and a community that believed her. And she was going to use every bit of that advantage not just for herself, but to create a blueprint that others could follow. 37 days after her arrest, Maya filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Steve Langford, the Metro Township Police Department, and the city under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, alleging violations of her Fourth Amendment rights, false arrest, excessive force, and malicious prosecution. She demanded $3 million in damages. But the lawsuit wasn't really about the money. It was about discovery. A federal lawsuit gave Maya subpoena power. It gave her the legal authority to demand every email, every training record, every personnel file, and every complaint that had ever been filed against Langford and the department. It gave her the power to depose the police chief, the training officers, and the city officials who'd ignored the red flags. It gave her a federal judge's oversight and the threat of sanctions if the department tried to hide evidence. The $3 million demand wasn't just compensation. It was a declaration of war against a system that had treated her like a criminal in her own home. And Maya Sterling had never lost a war she was prepared to fight. 6 months after Maya filed her lawsuit, Officer Steve Langford sat in a windowless conference room at the law offices of Chen and Associates, facing the deposition that would end his career. Across the table sat Maya's attorney, Jennifer Chen, a civil rights lawyer with a reputation for extracting confessions from cops the way surgeons extract tumors, precisely, methodically, and without mercy. Maya herself sat in the corner of the room, silent and observing, her presence a constant reminder to Langford of exactly who he'd assaulted on that porch. Chen started with the basics. She walked Langford through his training, his academy evaluations, his field training officers' concerns about defensive projection. Langford tried to dismiss them as overly cautious assessments from an FTO who didn't understand modern policing. Then Chen moved to the night of March 14th. She asked Langford to describe in his own words what he saw when he arrived at 1847 Oak Creek Circle. "I saw a suspicious individual attempting to gain entry to a residence," Langford said, his voice carrying the rehearsed confidence of someone who'd been coached by the city's attorneys. "Based on my training and experience, the individual's behavior was consistent with burglary." "What specifically about her behavior was consistent with burglary?" Chen asked. Langford hesitated. "She was fumbling with the lock. She appeared nervous. She didn't belong in that neighborhood." "How did you determine she didn't belong in that neighborhood, Officer Langford?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Langford knew he couldn't say what he was thinking, that a black woman in a hoodie didn't match his mental image of an Oak Creek Estates homeowner. So he deflected. "I meant she was acting suspiciously." Chen let it go for now. She moved to the physical encounter. "In your sworn incident report, you stated that Ms. Sterling made a sudden movement toward your service weapon. Is that correct?" "Yes," Langford said, sitting up straighter. This was his moment. This was where he got to play the victim, to explain how he'd feared for his life, how he'd reacted to a deadly threat with appropriate force. "She reached toward my duty belt. I perceived an imminent threat to my safety and the safety of the community. I had no choice but to—" Chen pressed a button on her laptop. The conference room's television screen flickered to life, showing the doorbell camera footage that had already destroyed Langford's credibility with his own department. The timestamp read, 9:18 p.m. The audio was crystal clear. "Let's watch this together, Officer Langford," Chen said quietly. They watched Maya standing on her porch, her hands visible, holding her keys. They watched her say calmly, "Officer, I'm going to reach into my pocket very slowly and show you my identification." They watched her move her hand toward her jacket pocket, not toward Langford's belt, not toward his weapon, but toward her own pocket where her wallet was. And they watched Langford explode into violence, swatting away her takeout bag and driving her to the ground while she remained completely motionless. Chen paused the video on a frame that showed Maya lying face down on the porch, her hands visible and empty, while Langford's knee pressed into her back. "Officer Langford, can you point to the moment in this video where Ms. Sterling reached for your service weapon?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Langford stared at the screen, his face draining of color. His attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He'd told this lie so many times, in his incident report, in his statement to Internal Affairs, in his initial deposition answers, that he'd almost started to believe it himself. But the video didn't lie. The video showed a woman trying to show her ID and a cop who saw a threat that didn't exist. I perceived her movement as a threat," Langford stammered. "That's not what I asked you, Officer Langford. I asked you to show me where in this video Ms. Sterling reached for your weapon." Langford couldn't answer. Because the answer was nowhere. She never reached for his weapon. She never lunged. She never did anything that justified the force he'd used. And in that moment, his qualified immunity defense, the legal doctrine that shields officers from liability for split-second decisions made in good faith, collapsed entirely. Qualified immunity doesn't protect officers who lie. It doesn't protect officers who fabricate threats. It doesn't protect officers who violate clearly established constitutional rights and then cover it up with a false report. "No further questions," Chen said, closing her laptop. 48 hours later, Officer Steve Langford was terminated from the Metro Township Police Department for dishonesty in an official investigation and excessive use of force. The State Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission revoked his certification, meaning he could never work as a police officer again in any jurisdiction. The District Attorney's Office reviewed 12 of Langford's previous arrests and dismissed all of them, citing his lack of credibility as a witness. 12 defendants, some of whom had already pleaded guilty based on Langford's testimony, had their cases thrown out because a cop who lied about assaulting a federal public defender couldn't be trusted about anything. The city settled Maya's lawsuit for $3 million. Unlike many civil rights plaintiffs who take the money and move on, Maya had other plans. She used the settlement to establish the Police Accountability Project, a non-profit legal organization that provides free representation to low-income victims of police misconduct. The project offers what Maya's clients never had: access to experienced civil rights attorneys, funding for expert witnesses, and the resources to fight cases all the way through trial. In its first year, the project took on 42 cases. It won or settled 38 of them. Maya returned to the Federal Public Defender's Office exactly 90 days after the settlement was finalized. But she was different now. She wasn't just a lawyer who intellectually understood her client's experiences with police violence. She was a survivor who had felt the knee in her back, the handcuffs cutting into her wrists, and the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in her own home. That experience gave her cross-examinations a new edge, sharper, more personal, more devastating. When she questioned police officers on the stand now, they could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what they were capable of and exactly how to dismantle their lies. The legal lessons from Maya Sterling's case are now taught in police academies and law schools across the country. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and courts have consistently held that pipe miao shu, or bu shuyu shek, which means matching the description or doesn't fit the area, is not probable cause for arrest, especially on private property. Under 18 U.S.C. paragraph Cox Sims Nellicum Cox, that it is a federal crime for anyone acting under color of law to willfully deprive a person of constitutional rights, and Langford's fabricated report turned a bad arrest into a criminal act. Finally, the case demonstrated the power of the digital witness. Doorbell cameras, body cameras, and cell phone footage have become the most credible evidence in civil rights cases, often outweighing officer testimony entirely. In the age of ubiquitous recording, lies don't just end careers, they create permanent records of misconduct that no amount of "feared for my safety" rhetoric can erase. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of Maya Sterling's story. If you take nothing else from this, remember this: your rights don't disappear just because a cop doesn't recognize them. Maya knew the law, she had resources, and she had evidence, and it still took a $3 million lawsuit to get justice. Imagine how many people without those advantages never get their day in court. If this story opened your eyes to how the system really works, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Send it to your family, your friends, anyone who thinks just comply and you'll be fine is the whole story. Because the truth is more complicated, more painful, and more important than that. I'll be back tomorrow with another story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about justice in America. And if you haven't seen it yet, check out my previous video on the screen right now. It's a story you absolutely cannot miss. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, and never forget, the law is only as strong as your willingness to fight for it.